Most people think discipline is about grinding harder, waking up earlier, or watching one more motivational video before bed. Except there was a man in 17th century Japan who killed his first opponent at the age of 13, fought over 60 duels without losing a single one, and then, at the end of his life, sat down in a cave and wrote 21 rules for living. Not for fighting, for living. His name was Miyamoto Musashi. And the strange part is, almost none of his rules mention swords, combat, or physical strength. Instead, they describe a way of thinking so ruthlessly clear that modern psychologists are just now catching up to what this wandering samurai figured out 400 years ago. Here's what nobody tells you about discipline. It was never about effort. It was always about elimination. Tonight, we're breaking down 8 practices directly inspired by Musashi's philosophy, adapted for the modern world, for screens and notifications and endless choices that would have made even a legendary swordsman lose his mind. These aren't motivational platitudes, these are operational principles. And fair warning, some of this is going to feel backwards. Some of it will sound almost too simple. But that's exactly how Musashi designed it. Because the man who won 60 duels believed that complexity is where discipline goes to die. Let's start with the one that most people get wrong on the first try. Musashi wrote something that translates roughly to, "See things as they are, not as you wish them to be." Sounds almost too obvious, right? Like something you'd find on a poster in a dentist's office. But here's the thing about this principle. It's not a philosophy lesson, it's a survival mechanism. And when you actually try to practice it, honestly practice it, you realize how terrifyingly difficult it is. Think about the last time you started a new project, a business idea, a fitness plan, a creative goal. What did you do first? If you're like most people, you imagined the end result. You pictured yourself 30 pounds lighter, or holding that check, or standing on that stage. Researchers at New York University actually studied this. They found that people who vividly fantasize about positive outcomes end up with lower energy and worse results than people who focus on the obstacles standing in their way. The brain literally can't tell the difference between imagining success and experiencing it. So when you spend 20 minutes daydreaming about your future self, your nervous system goes, "Great, we did it," and down-regulates the motivation you'd need to actually get off the couch. Musashi would have called this a fatal opening. In a duel, the moment you start thinking about winning instead of watching your opponent's actual movements, you're already dead. The modern equivalent is the entrepreneur who spends 3 months designing a logo instead of talking to customers. Fantasy dressed up as preparation. The practice is this. Every single evening, spend 10 minutes reviewing your day with brutal, factual honesty. Not, "How do I feel about today?" but "What actually happened today?" Did you do the work you said you would? How many hours did you actually spend on the thing that matters versus the thing that felt productive? Write it down. Numbers, times, actual outputs. No adjectives, no emotions, no excuses, just data. One guy who ran a small marketing agency told an interviewer that he started doing this after reading about Musashi, and within 3 weeks he realized he was spending almost 4 hours a day on tasks that generated 0 revenue. 4 hours every day. He thought he was grinding. The data said he was hiding. That's the gap between fantasy and reality. And most people never close it because they never measure it. Here's what makes this uncomfortable. When you start tracking reality instead of narrating a story about reality, you lose the comfort of your own mythology. You can't be the hard worker who just hasn't caught a break yet when the numbers show you spent 11 hours last week scrolling through content that added nothing to your life. Musashi didn't have Instagram, but he understood the principle perfectly. A warrior who lies to himself about his skill level doesn't get a second chance to correct the error. The truth might bruise your ego, but the lie will eventually break your legs. But accepting reality is only the foundation. Because even when you see things clearly, there's a second force working against you that Musashi identified centuries before any neuroscientist gave it a name. Musashi's second principle was essentially this: do not pursue pleasure for its own sake. Now, before this sounds like some monk telling you to give up everything enjoyable and sit in a gray room eating rice, let's be clear about what Musashi actually meant. He wasn't against pleasure, he was against pleasure as a default setting. There's a massive difference. Think about it like this. Your brain has a reward system that evolved to help you survive in an environment of scarcity. Food was rare, so finding it felt incredible. Social connection was dangerous, so belonging to a tribe released powerful chemicals. That system worked perfectly for about 200,000 years. And then, in the last 20 years, we built an entire economy designed to hijack it. Every app on your phone, every streaming platform, every social media feed, they're all competing for the same real estate in your brain. The dopamine pathway that Musashi intuitively understood was the enemy of discipline. Not because dopamine is bad, but because when you can get it for free, without effort, without growth, you destroy the mechanism that was supposed to motivate you toward difficult, meaningful work. A neuroscientist at Stanford demonstrated this clearly. When you scroll through short-form video content, your brain receives small, unpredictable dopamine hits approximately every 3 to 8 seconds. That's the same reward pattern as a slot machine, and after about 40 minutes of that, your baseline dopamine level actually drops below where it was before you started. So you didn't just waste 40 minutes, you made yourself less motivated than you were before you picked up the phone. Musashi's practice for this was elegant in its simplicity. He deliberately chose discomfort over convenience, not as punishment, but as training. He walked instead of riding. He ate simple food when rich food was available. He slept on hard ground even when offered beds, not because comfort was evil, but because he refused to let his body dictate terms to his mind. The modern adaptation works like this. Identify the 3 things you reach for when you feel bored, restless, or slightly uncomfortable. For most people, it's the phone, food, or some form of passive entertainment. For the next 30 days, insert a 15-minute gap between the impulse and the action. Feel the urge to check social media? Set a timer for 15 minutes and do literally anything else. Sit with the discomfort. Feel the pull. Watch it rise, peak, and, this is the part nobody tells you about, fade. Because it always fades, usually within 7 to 12 minutes. That restless, itchy, I need something feeling has an expiration date. But you'll never discover that if you always give in at minute 2. If you're serious about mastering your impulses, instead of being controlled by them, go deeper with the KMA method. It's a practical system built to harden your focus, train your will, and make discipline automatic in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the pinned comment below. One software developer documented his experiment with this on a forum. He tracked his screen time for a month and found he was averaging over 5 hours of non-work phone use daily. After implementing the 15-minute delay rule, without trying to reduce usage, just delaying it, his average dropped to about 90 minutes. Not because he white-knuckled through withdrawal, but because most of those 5 hours weren't driven by genuine desire. They were reflexes. Automatic responses to micro-discomfort that his brain had learned to solve with the easiest available dopamine. Musashi would have recognized this instantly. In sword combat, the most dangerous fighter isn't the one who attacks constantly. It's the one who can feel the urge to attack and wait. Because in that gap between impulse and action lives everything that separates a master from a casualty. But cutting out mindless pleasure only creates a vacuum. And here's where Musashi's third principle comes in. Because if you don't understand this next part, the vacuum fills itself with something even worse. Musashi wrote that a warrior should have no attachment to desires. And this is where most modern interpretations go completely sideways. People read this and think it means you shouldn't want things. No ambition, no goals, no drive. Just float through life like a leaf on water. But that's not what Musashi practiced. The man who fought 60 duels clearly wanted to win. The man who wrote one of the greatest strategy texts in human history clearly wanted to create something lasting. Desire wasn't the enemy. Attachment to desire was the enemy. Here's the distinction, and it's the kind of thing that takes about 5 seconds to understand intellectually and about 5 years to actually embody. You can want something and pursue it with everything you have while simultaneously being completely willing to lose it. You can train for a fight and accept that you might not win. You can build a business and accept that it might fail. You can love someone and accept that they might leave. The wanting isn't the problem. The problem is when the wanting turns into needing, when your identity gets welded to the outcome, when you can't imagine being okay if this particular thing doesn't work out. This matters for discipline because attachment creates rigidity, and rigidity creates fragility. The person who needs their business to succeed starts making desperate decisions when revenue dips. The person who needs to hit their fitness goal by a specific date starts overtraining, gets injured, and quits entirely. Attachment turns goals into prisons, and people locked in prisons don't move with discipline. They move with desperation. The practice Musashi would recognize in modern life is digital minimalism taken further than most people are willing to go. Once a week, go through your phone and delete any app you haven't used with genuine intention in the past 7 days. If an app exists on your phone only because it might be useful someday, or because everyone else has it, or because deleting it feels strangely scary, that's attachment. And attachment is weight. But extend this beyond technology. Look at your goals. Are you pursuing them because they genuinely matter to you right now? Or because you announce them publicly and quitting would mean admitting you changed your mind? Are you holding on to a career path because it aligns with who you actually are, or because you've invested so much time that walking away feels like failure? A former military officer turned executive coach describes this as the sunk cost of identity. People will endure years of misery in a career they hate, not because they can't leave, but because they've told so many people they're a lawyer or a doctor that leaving would require rebuilding their entire self-concept. Musashi would have seen this as a warrior clinging to a broken sword because it was his father's. Sentimental, understandable, and fatal. The antidote is regular, honest auditing. Not just of your apps and possessions, but of your commitments, your relationships, and the stories you tell about who you are. Hold each one lightly. Pursue what matters fiercely, but grip nothing so tightly that losing it would destroy you. Because in Musashi's world, the swordsman who feared death more than anything else was always the first one to die. That principle sets up something even harder to practice, though, because once you stop clinging to your own desires, you have to confront the most uncomfortable question in all of personal development. Musashi's fourth principle is one that virtually nobody in the modern self-improvement space talks about, and for good reason. It doesn't sell courses. It doesn't make for good Instagram quotes. He essentially said, think less about yourself and more about the world around you. In a culture that runs on personal branding, self-optimization, and main character energy, this sounds almost heretical. But Musashi wasn't being humble for the sake of humility. He was being strategic. Here's the thing about excessive self-focus. It narrows your field of vision. And in any competitive environment, a narrow field of vision gets you killed. Musashi won his duels not because he was the fastest or the strongest, but because he studied his opponents with an obsessive attention that bordered on the supernatural. He watched how they stood, how they breathed, how their eyes moved before they struck. He once defeated a renowned swordsman simply by arriving late to the duel, because he understood that the waiting would destabilize his opponent's mental state more than any technique ever could. In modern life, the equivalent is the person in the meeting who talks the least and notices the most. The negotiator who spends 80% of their preparation researching the other party's pressures and constraints instead of rehearsing their own arguments. The entrepreneur who succeeds not because they had the best product, but because they understood their customer's actual behavior, not the behavior the customer claimed to have, but the real patterns, the ones you can only see when you stop thinking about yourself long enough to truly observe. Research in organizational psychology backs this up. Studies of high-performing teams show that the most valuable members aren't the ones with the highest individual output. They're the ones with the highest situational awareness, the ability to read the room, anticipate problems, and adapt before anyone else realizes there's a problem to adapt to. The practice is simple but staggeringly difficult. In your next conversation or meeting, instead of thinking about what you're going to say next, focus entirely on what the other person is communicating. Not just their words, their posture, their micro-expressions, the things they repeat, which signal importance, and the things they avoid, which signal fear. After the interaction, write down 3 things you noticed that you would have missed if you'd been thinking about yourself. Do this for 2 weeks, and something strange starts happening. You begin to see patterns that were invisible before. You notice opportunities in the gap between what people say they want and what their behavior reveals they actually need. That kind of perception is worth more than any technique, any hack, any morning routine. Because Musashi didn't win 60 duels by being the best swordsman, he won by being the best observer. But observation without action is just entertainment, which is why Musashi's 5th principle hits the hardest for anyone stuck in planning mode. Do not hesitate once you have decided. 7 words that probably made Musashi more dangerous than any amount of physical training, because hesitation isn't caution. Hesitation is the gap where doubt rushes in, reconfigures your thinking, and convinces you that waiting a little longer, researching a little more, getting just one more opinion is the smart move. It never is. It's the disguise that fear wears when it doesn't want to admit its fear. Musashi observed that in a duel, there's a moment of commitment. The instant a swordsman decides to strike, that decision must flow into action without interruption. If there's even a fractional pause between the decision and the execution, the opponent detects it. Not consciously, but at the level of animal instinct. They sense the hesitation, and the window closes. In many of Musashi's accounts, duels were decided not by skill, but by the half-second gap between intention and commitment. The swordsman who decided and moved as a single unified action won. The one who decided, paused, and then moved was already losing. The modern version of this is pathological. People spend weeks researching the perfect productivity system instead of doing the work. They draft business plans for months while their competitor launches a half-baked version and captures the market. They read 17 books about writing before typing a single paragraph. This is what productivity culture has created, a generation that is extraordinarily prepared and completely paralyzed. Here's a technique that implements Musashi's principle with almost surgical precision. It's the 2-minute decision protocol. When you identify a task, goal, or decision, give yourself exactly 2 minutes to plan your first action. Not the entire roadmap, just the next single physical action. Then, execute it immediately. Not after lunch, not tomorrow morning when you're fresh. Now, want to start a business? Your 2-minute plan might be, write down the 10 people who might buy this and text the first 3. Want to get in shape? Put on shoes and walk out the front door. Want to write a book? Open a document and type 1 terrible paragraph. The key isn't quality. It's the unbroken chain between decision and movement. A behavioral researcher who studied procrastination for over 20 years found something remarkable. The single biggest predictor of task completion wasn't motivation or planning quality. It was the time gap between deciding to do something and physically starting it. If that gap was under 2 minutes, completion rates were above 80%. If it stretched beyond 72 hours, completion dropped below 10%. Musashi would have put it more bluntly. A samurai who sheathes his sword between the decision to fight and the fight itself has already surrendered. The modern sheathing is, let me think about it. I'll start Monday. I need to do more research first. These phrases feel responsible. They feel mature. And they are, in Musashi's framework, the words of someone who has already lost. But acting decisively on the wrong things is just productive chaos. And that's where Musashi's sixth principle transforms everything, because it addresses the fuel source that most people ignore entirely. Embrace discomfort daily. Now, this one has been co-opted by every cold shower bro and no days off influencer on the internet, so let's strip away the performative toughness and get to what Musashi actually meant. He wasn't advocating for suffering as an aesthetic. He wasn't trying to prove anything to an audience. He deliberately chose hard paths because he understood a mechanism that modern science has only recently confirmed: the relationship between voluntary hardship and psychological resilience. When you voluntarily expose yourself to discomfort, something specific happens in your prefrontal cortex. The brain region responsible for executive function, impulse control, and long-term planning literally strengthens its connections. It's like a muscle that only grows under load. And the key word is voluntarily. Being forced into cold water because your heater broke doesn't produce the same neurological effect as choosing to step into cold water when warm water is available. The choice is the active ingredient. The discomfort is just the delivery mechanism. This is exactly why Musashi slept on stone when silk was offered, why he walked through rain when shelter was 10 steps away. He wasn't punishing himself, he was training the part of his brain that allowed him to remain calm, focused, and strategic in moments when other swordsmen panicked. Because panic is just the untrained brain's response to unexpected discomfort. And the brain that has been voluntarily exposed to discomfort hundreds of times develops a fundamentally different relationship with the unexpected. The practical framework is what some researchers call controlled stress inoculation. Pick one uncomfortable thing per day. Not dangerous, not reckless, just uncomfortable. Take the cold shower. Skip the morning coffee until noon. Sit in silence for 20 minutes with no phone. Have the difficult conversation you've been avoiding. Fast until dinner. Exercise past the point where you want to quit. The discomforts rotate, they escalate gradually, and they compound. Because after 90 days of daily voluntary discomfort, something fundamental shifts. You develop what military psychologists call stress tolerance bandwidth. Most people have an extremely narrow bandwidth. A bad night's sleep, a missed meal, an unexpected bill, and their discipline crumbles. But the person who has trained in voluntary discomfort for months has a bandwidth so wide that ordinary stress barely registers. Traffic, deadlines, difficult colleagues, these stop being crises and start being background noise. A former special operations instructor once explained it simply: the toughest moments in selection aren't the ones that test your body, they're the ones that test your ability to think clearly when your body is screaming at you to stop. And you can't develop that ability by reading about it, only by choosing, over and over, to step into the thing your instincts tell you to avoid. Musashi embodied this so completely that contemporaries described him as almost eerily calm. Not emotionless, calm. Emotionless people suppress what they feel. Calm people feel everything and act anyway. That's the product of voluntary discomfort, a nervous system so trained that it treats chaos as data rather than as threat. But even that level of resilience has a vulnerability, and it's the one thing Musashi wrote about more than almost anything else. Maintain absolute presence. This is the practice that ties everything else together, and it's the one that modern life makes almost impossibly difficult. Musashi believed that the mind should be like water, fully present wherever it is, taking the shape of whatever container it occupies, never scattered across multiple locations at once. In a duel, this meant total absorption in the immediate moment. Not thinking about the last strike or planning the next one, not calculating odds or remembering techniques, just seeing, purely and completely, what is happening right now. The problem is that the modern mind is almost never present. Research from Harvard found that the average person's mind wanders approximately 47% of the time, not during boring tasks, during everything. And here's what shocked the researchers. Mind wandering was a stronger predictor of unhappiness than the actual activity being performed. People doing unpleasant tasks while fully present reported higher well-being than people doing enjoyable tasks while mentally elsewhere. Musashi figured this out with a sword. Harvard confirmed it with data. The practice is meditation, but probably not the way most people think of it. Forget the incense and the guided apps telling you to imagine a peaceful meadow. Musashi's meditation was combative, active. It was about training the mind to stay where you put it, the same way you'd train a dog to stay on a mat. Start with 10 minutes. Sit upright. Close your eyes. Focus on one thing, your breathing, a sound, the feeling of your hands. When your mind wanders, and it will wander within about 6 seconds on your first attempt, notice where it went and bring it back. No frustration, no judgment, just redirect. The first week will feel pointless. The second week will feel frustrating. Somewhere around week 3 or 4, you'll start noticing something outside the meditation sessions. You'll catch yourself reaching for your phone and actually pause. You'll be in a conversation and realize you're actually listening instead of waiting for your turn to talk. You'll sit down to work and find that the first 20 minutes of focus come easier than they used to. These aren't dramatic changes. They're subtle, but they compound at a rate that becomes unmistakable over months. A cognitive neuroscientist who has studied meditators for decades found that consistent practice, even 10 minutes daily, produces measurable changes in the brain within about 8 weeks. Specifically, it changes your relationship to wandering thoughts. Instead of being hijacked by every random impulse, you develop the capacity to notice the thought and choose whether to follow it. That choice, that tiny gap between stimulus and response, is what Musashi called the void, the empty space where mastery lives. And it applies directly to discipline because every failure of discipline follows the same pattern. An impulse arises, attention follows the impulse automatically, and before you've made a conscious decision, you're 3 episodes into a show you didn't intend to watch. Or you've eaten half a bag of something you weren't hungry for. Or you've spent an hour arguing with a stranger online about something that won't matter tomorrow. Presence interrupts that chain. Not by suppressing the impulse, but by creating a gap between the impulse and the response. And in that gap, discipline isn't hard. It's almost automatic, because when you're truly present, the right action is usually obvious. It's only when you're mentally scattered that the wrong action masquerades as the easy one. But presence without direction is just peaceful stagnation, which is exactly why Musashi's final practice exists, and it's the one that turns all the others from interesting ideas into an actual operating system for your life. Review and simplify. Always. Musashi, at the end of his life, lived in a cave, not because he was broken, not because he had failed, because he had systematically stripped away everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. His swordsmanship followed the same trajectory. He began with complex techniques, dozens of stances, elaborate footwork, intricate strategies, and over decades, he simplified. By his final years, his style was almost unrecognizable to classical swordsmen. It was too simple, too direct, too bare, and completely unbeatable. There's a pattern here that repeats across virtually every domain of human excellence. Beginners learn rules. Intermediates learn exceptions. Masters simplify. The chess grandmaster doesn't see more possibilities than the intermediate player. They see fewer. The expert writer doesn't use more words. They use fewer. This principle applies to discipline with devastating effectiveness, because most people, when they try to build discipline, add things. They add morning routines, evening routines, journaling practices, meal prep schedules, workout splits, reading lists, habit trackers, accountability partners. They keep adding until their disciplined life requires more cognitive overhead than a space shuttle launch. And then, inevitably, the system collapses under its own weight. They miss one day of the 17 habit stack, feel like a failure, and abandon the whole structure. Musashi's approach is the opposite. Instead of asking, "What should I add?" Ask, what should I remove? Instead of building a morning routine, eliminate the things that make mornings chaotic. Instead of creating elaborate meal plans, stop buying the food you're trying to avoid. Subtraction is almost always more powerful than addition, but it doesn't feel as productive. Deleting Instagram takes 3 seconds and feels like quitting. Adding a 2-hour morning routine takes a week to design and feels like winning. But 3 months later, the person who deleted the app has reclaimed over 100 hours, and the person with the elaborate routine has already abandoned it twice. The nightly review practice works like this. Every evening, spend 5 minutes answering 3 questions. What did I do today that moved me toward what matters? What did I do today that was unnecessary? What can I eliminate tomorrow? No gratitude lists, no affirmations, just a daily audit of signal versus noise. Over weeks, this process reveals patterns that are invisible in real time. You'll notice that certain activities always show up in the unnecessary column. You'll discover that your most productive hours follow a predictable rhythm. You'll find that the things you thought were essential were actually just familiar. An entrepreneur who sold his company for a significant amount once described what he called ruthless simplification. Every Sunday, he reviewed his calendar and commitments and asked one question about each item. If this didn't already exist in my life, would I actively add it? If the answer was no, he removed it. Within a year, his weekly commitments dropped from over 40 recurring items to 8, and his output more than doubled. Not because he worked harder, because he stopped spending energy on things that didn't matter. Musashi died in that cave having simplified his entire existence down to the essentials: a brush for writing, a sword for practice, and a mind so clear that in his final weeks he produced the Book of 5 Rings, a text studied continuously for nearly 4 centuries, not because it's complex, but because it's so simple that each reading reveals another layer. That's the paradox of discipline that Musashi understood, and most people never grasp. Discipline doesn't come from adding structure to chaos. It comes from removing chaos